Great to be with you for this Per Capita webinar with Julianne Schultz, who I've known for many years now. Julianne, of course, is the publisher and founding editor of Griffith Review and Professor of Media and Culture in the Griffith University Centre for Social and Cultural Research. She also chairs the editorial advisory board at The Conversation and has also been on boards such as the ABC at a time when I was working for the Communications Minister, which is how we met, the Grattan Institute and the Copyright Agency. She's also chaired the Australian Film, TV and Radio School, Queensland Design Council and the National Cultural Policy Reference Group. She is a renowned author and also received a Member of the Order of Australia for her services to journalism and the community in 2009, and it became an honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities the following year. Julianne's genuinely a thought leader on Australia's culture, on our media, on structures of power, and I'm absolutely delighted to have her join us today. I would like to also acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and thank them for the custodianship of the land and waters on which we live, land which was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Julianne is joining us from elsewhere in the country, but she's here to talk to you today about her book, The Idea of Australia, A Search for the Soul of the Nation, which I usually would have with me, but having just moved house, it's in a box and I can't find it. But as you can see, it's there behind Julianne today. It is a really, really terrific book, one of my favourite reads of the last couple of years. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about, before I get on to that, housekeeping, or I'll be in terrible trouble. As most of you will know, we do take questions towards the end of this hour together. If you can post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, please do so, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I can when we come to that point later in the hour. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website, as all our webinars are. So Julianne, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Emma. It's a great privilege. I'm very pleased to be able to have this chat with you.
Lovely to have you with us. What inspired you to write this book?
Look, it's a very interesting question when you've got this fat book in front of you. Why did I decide to do that? What precisely was it? I wrote it on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, where I have lived for the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that the reason, well, I know that I'd long thought that there was a need to write a book which was about the idea of Australia, because increasingly I found that people were a bit at a loss about how to get their ideas around what it meant to be Australian and what the defining idea of the place had become. I think many of us who grew up, through the 70s, 80s and 90s, had a strong sense of what it meant to be Australian, and we benefited from the sort of opening up and redefinitions that occurred, over that period. But then we sort of lost our way a bit, I think it's fair to say. And I think a lot of people just sort of felt a bit cut loose and unsure, what does this mean? Partly it was unfashionable to think about national identity, sort of global age, we're all citizens of the world, and, that was comfortable for a while. But as Anthony Kwame Appiah said recently, what does that mean? How can you be a citizen of the world? Everyone comes from somewhere and carries with them both baggage, insights and responsibilities as a result. So that, I guess, was the general starting point that I had. COVID happened. I couldn't do my normal lifestyle of jumping on and off planes and doing all sorts of busy things. I was stuck in my very nice study in northern New South Wales. And so I thought, well, this is the time that I need to do this. And what I pitched to the publishers initially was a fairly sort of almost like a meditation, on what this meant, what this sort of question of identity meant and how it could be applied, in this time and age. And my publisher very quickly said to me, that all the books that have been written around this sort of topic have been written by men. There obviously been very good historians who've been, women historians and others who've been writing in areas of, different particular niches. But the big sort of overview stuff has very much been a male field. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really put it together like that before. So I started on the project. And as I developed, I realised, as I was writing, I realised that I had to explain more about the history. I had to to dig down into the history to try and find those, what I'm calling the red threads, the tendrils that connect us all the way back, that make sense of how we respond now. So I can just go on a little bit more if that's all right. So I guess in many ways for me, the sort of really key starting point was the election of Pauline Hansen in 1996. Now, as people will recall, she was a disendorsed Liberal Party candidate. And as I write in the book, if you didn't know better, you would think it was an out-of-town tryout for the sort of rise of, the sort of politics that we've now become accustomed to, where once unspeakable things could be said out loud from the rooftops. Yeah. The thing that interested me at the time, I was working for the Courier Mail in Brisbane, and the thing that struck me at the time was that the reaction, the people who voted for Pauline were, not without some justification, felt excluded. They weren't as well educated. They weren't benefiting as much from the restructuring of the economy that had gone on over the previous decade. They felt left behind. And so they were angry. That was a sort of not unreasonable sort of response. Look at me, you've actually got to pay attention. It was a reasonable response, at some levels. The racist language and so on was not. And what was interesting, when Pauline was first elected and in the parliament and elsewhere, she was rejected. There was a sense that this was not an acceptable part of the dialogue in late 20th century Australia. It was a throwback to the language that was used with gay abandon for the first half of the century, but we had changed and it was no longer part of the acceptable dialogue. What struck me and everybody else, like 2 years later, she basically blows up the Liberal National Party in Queensland by getting 20% or more of the vote. And we have ever since lived with a politics where that sort of thinking has become the baseline from which everything happens. So we've been pulled back to something which has really deep roots in this country. So I think that was my starting point in many ways of trying to understand how that had happened, why that had happened, and what the consequences of it were for us thinking about ourselves as, an idealised Australia.
And then that's why I think I found the book so compelling, because it was a galvanising moment for me, Pauline Hansen's election. I was in my early 20s and I was shocked. I remember being absolutely shocked. This is not the Australia I grew up in. And I think a lot of my political engagement now rests on the fact that I grew up in that 1980s Australia, and in Victoria we had the Kane government. And so we had really progressive reforming governments, and I assumed that's the way it was. Pauline Hansen was shocking. I think my very first opinion piece that I ever had published was about her comeback in 2004. And by then, even then, that's 18 years ago now, I was saying, hang on, she said in 2004, I think a lot of what I said back then has become Howard government policy, and that I found that even more enraging, and that's what sort of set me on a path of entering public life. So it's a very interesting starting point. Of course, when she was elected, Howard played that very cannily and didn't reject her the way that the rest of the established elite did.
And much of the Liberal Party rejected it. It wasn't as though it was, divided on old party lines. His approach. I've lost your sound.
He was disendorsed from the Liberal Party. But what Howard then did was go on to co-opt a lot of those supporters into his base, and that, to me, shows how we've shifted society since then. He wanted people to be relaxed and comfortable, and that's something that comes through in your book. You talk about that attitude of a certain side of Australia that doesn't want us to think, that doesn't want us to pay attention to these things, that wants us to be disengaged, and that relaxed and comfortable was almost a metaphor for that.
Yeah, that's right. And look, one of the things that, that process, it's important. I think it's important for people, for all of us, to really understand how those deep threads of history play through. And so, one of the things that I do in the book is, I write a bit about the sort of colonial settlement. I write about, a lot of emphasis on, the incurable flaw to settle with First Nations people. But in a way, not the focus, but a really important staging point, which I think we haven't paid enough attention to, is the process of federation. Because it's that federation that it's no longer Australia doing what as colonial entities, what is wanted out of London, which good and bad, different things. It's very much a deliberate sort of process that we actually have to own. And the decisions that were made at that time, both in the lead up to Federation and in the early Federation parliaments, were ones which have had really long-term consequences. And I think that really, people sort of wave around white Australia policy as though it was something, or they say in fleeting, oh, well, we gave women the vote early, very early. But they don't say, well, actually, women having the vote should have been part of the Constitution. It should have been there as a right rather than a political deal. The whole process of the White Australia policy, starting with the deportation of the South Sea Islanders back to the Solomons and other Melanesian places, was a deliberate strategy for reasons that still reverberate, as we see in the debates that are going on, now in the election campaign around the Solomons. So I guess what I was trying to do was to say, actually, let's look at the contest that was going on, because this was not a given. There was always a contest, and why some things stick and some things don't, and what the consequences of that might be.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk a bit about that, because you do, I think your book is very clear-eyed about the role of race in Australia, which too many books aren't. Too many analyses even buy into what you rightly identify is the cultural practice of deliberately forgetting. Best to forget some of these ways. And yet that initial fault line, that initial dispossession, failure to negotiate a treaty, colours everything that underlies Australian culture. And so now that we're at a critical juncture, really, with a voice, Uluru Voice, being supported by the majority of First Nations people, but we have one side of politics saying, yes, they'll try to enact that and they'll try to go to a referendum in the first term, and the other side, the Prime Minister quite explicitly, I think yesterday, saying, no, that is not our policy. How does your analysis of the way these two sides, this competition pulls against each other, see that playing out ahead?
Well, I desperately hope that that what happens is that there is a referendum in that first term of an incoming Labor government, should they be elected. Jeremy Bentham wrote in 1803 that the failure to negotiate treaties was an incurable flaw. And one of the things I do in the book is just trace through, the long history of people attempting to negotiate, of attempting to get to some formal agreements, whether it's, separate territories or, the great petitions and so on. And time and again, nothing happens. I mean, in my view, the whole Uluru process and its outcome was the greatest development of deliberative democracy that this country has ever seen. The outcome of it was not what the officials wanted. It was not what they would have gone with a straight template. It was refined and developed through that process, and that was done. I mean, it's something that you need to treasure and take very, very seriously and respectfully. My sense, and I was saying this to somebody the other day, when Malcolm Turnbull quite wrongly and for quite cavalier political reasons said, oh, it's a beautiful statement, but it would be a third parliament, we can't have that. Now, obviously he was wrong. He knew that was a misstatement. It was a line that had been promulgated very deliberately and very actively for some time by think tanks who would not share your worldview, Emma. And it was an outrage. But the important point is, and I think this is something we need to acknowledge, the Uluru process of voice, constitutional recognition, voice, truth-telling and treaty does represent a shift in power. There is a different sort of power that will reside in the land if that recognition occurs. And the consequences of that, I think, would be profoundly good, not just for First Nations people, but I think it would also begin to provide a bit of air for saying, actually, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to start looking at more carefully. It's not a given. I mean, our constitution was written by a bunch of whiskery blokes, on a boat when they had the flu. I mean, they had a COVID type. They're writing this thing, and there were lots of other ideas around of what might have been in that constitution that were just dismissed. Now, I'm not being, I'm not making grand claims for this, but I do think that that process of clarification that would come through adopting Uluru and through the, the recognition of the power that necessarily attaches to First Nations people. In my longer term view, I think that could be a starting point for a real reinvigoration of what, of how we operate and function. So I think it is the most fundamental thing. It's been striking to me to watch how, I think that there's no doubt that in Anthony Albanese's speech the other day, that was clear and centre. In the reporting of it, that wasn't the case. They go to the dot points about, the other issues which will be addressed. I mean, in one of them, I read this morning, was saying, oh, well, he promised to adopt, have a referendum on Uluru to introduce EV charging vehicles and, something else. And I thought, get the proportion right. This is foundational. You actually need to take it very much more seriously. I've been struck that while the independents, in the Teal independents, are obviously pursuing very urgent, very real issues, and they're addressing another of the legacies of that Howard period. When people who were arguing against Pauline Hansen, who were arguing against the refugee policy, who were arguing, taking a much more traditional liberal point of view, were derided as being doctors' wives. They've shown that actually many of them are doctors. Some of them might be doctors' wives, but they've certainly got agency. So I think that process of recognising the importance of Uluru as a foundational thing, I would like to see the independents giving that more weight. I understand sort of why they're not, but I think that not elevating it is a shortcoming in some of the campaigns.
Why do you think they're not? Because I think what's interesting to me is the three things they've chosen to run on: integrity in politics, equality for women, and climate change, are things that shouldn't be partisan issues. They're not left-right issues. But one side of politics and those with power have turned Uluru, have turned Indigenous recognition into a political issue, just as they've done with climate change.
Well, I think Indigenous recognition has always been a political issue, and the basic tactic is deny, push off, avoid, and I think that's no longer
that shift in power that would come.
Yeah, that's right, and that's no longer acceptable. And partly, partly it's a product of the assertion that's coming from First Nations people, and the fact that, I'm not making great claims about universities in this, but the fact that for people who were once way below the national national levels, the first Aboriginal people to graduate from the universities in Australia was in 1967. That was it. There's a bit of dispute around the edges about who was first and who was second and who was third, but it's the 1960s before this has happened. So if you compare that with other settler societies, that's way below the standard. If you compare it with countries like South Africa or the United States, way, way off it. But what you've now got is this big generation of really well-educated, assertive, and people who are not going to put up with that, that belittling, shaming, ignoring, pushing aside. So I do think that the dynamic has changed. One of the other things that I think is really important in how the texture of the country has changed. There's been a big increase in population, obviously, over this period. I grew up in an Australia which was still essentially a rural-based society. And rural-based Australia, from way back, they knew exactly what had happened. They knew about the displacement, and they knew that in most country towns there were shanty towns and there were tin cities and whatever they were called. They knew, the consequences of, a couple of hundred years of dismissive treatment was in your face. You couldn't avoid it in country Australia. I think what you now see is a much more urban society. You see a society where people have come from many other countries in the world. This is not something about my plot of land as a farmer, being in contest. This is actually about the fabric of the nation. And I think that dynamic that is there means that as a whole, it's not a rump of the National Party protecting a bit of territory. It's actually something which, and the surveys show this, people see this as a wrong that needs to be righted.
Yeah, absolutely. interestingly, we released a report yesterday on looking at housing affordability in Australia, and I have a thesis which we haven't expanded in this report because it's a factual piece of work, that Australians' relationship to land is skewed because of this original dispossession. Because people came from a country, white settlers came to Australia from a country where land was owned by the aristocracy. And so the land grab, the ability to hold on to your bit of land here is deeply embedded in our psyche. And that's the original dispossession.
Yeah. I talk about, the industries which have been the handmaids of government, and at its core is property. At its core is ownership of the land. And, so that's why, when I say that there is a real power shift. I mean, First Nations people have a very different, but in, as intense in a different sense, relationship with the land. The land is integral. That is it. Our notion.
Land isn't ours, we belong to the land.
Yeah, that's right. And so our Western view of land is something to acquire, aggregate, and exploit. So that's a profound difference. But yes, I mean, at the point that, when Governor Phillip arrived, he started off with the notion of the land being commons. There would be this sort of, very romantic sort of idea of, common land that was shared by the poor folk who'd arrived. And that didn't take long. I mean, within 3 or 4 years, land was the commodity in the penal colony, and it has been ever since. And so housing is part of that, because we talk about housing. Housing has become about the only investment strategy that you have. It's about putting money into house and land. We don't have a diverse investment range of options. You've got some money by chance, where do you put it? You buy another property, because that will always keep increasing, because it's got this sort of land thing underneath it. And that, I think, has had profound distorting consequences for for the whole economy at one level. The people that there aren't those other forms of investment in other sort of much more sophisticated forms. It means that banking is way, it's all about private home ownership.
In Australia is property, and property. In the UK it's 20%. Right? My colleague Matt Lloyd-Kate told me that yesterday at the launch.
Yeah.
It has profoundly skewed our economy, but also our culture.
Absolutely. And so I think that what happened, and it's been interesting hearing some of the discussion as interest rates creep up. I mean, I remember what it was like to have a mortgage that went up to 17% interest rate. I mean, and somebody was on the radio this morning saying, but the houses were only 30,000 then. They weren't. I mean, the financialisation of housing began to happen as those sort of economic reforms were introduced in the early 1980s. So the chance of getting a $30,000 house anywhere near Sydney by 1983 was impossible. I know I moved to the Illawarra. I moved to Scarborough on the south coast, north of Wollongong, where we bought a miner's shack for $28,000, or bought a block of land, built a shack. Those houses are now worth $2 and $3 million. This is a complete perversion, and it's come by the financialisation of housing and turning it into an investment category first and foremost, rather than a home.
Precisely the theme of our work that we released yesterday.
Excellent. We're clearly on the same page. And I mean, Emma, you know, because you've read the book, but I mean, I write a bit about living in the inner eastern suburbs of Sydney, in some of the more affluent parts of Sydney, and the process of how that idea of land, of taking of land, of appropriating it, of aggregating it, has distorted that, that subset of as well. I mean, if you look at the rich lists, there are people who come out of mining and banking and agriculture and so on. But the bedrock of them all, where they spend their money, is in property.
Precisely. It's a national obsession, and it's uniquely, I think, dominant in Australia. And I maintain it goes back to that original.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right.
Let's talk a bit about, though, you do identify in the book the power of those big four sectors in Australia: agriculture, mining, banking, and media as their handmaiden. Explain that thesis to the audience. I found it fascinating.
Okay. Look, I think part of it was in my thinking. I mean, just what I had to do when I started writing the book was, I thought I knew the history pretty well, but I realised I had to read more to actually make an argument and pull the tendrils together. And certainly when the drafts of the book went out to people to read, they'd say, "Oh, I need to know more about this because I don't know about this. Can you please explain?" And so it grew from being a small little meditation, which I thought it was going to be, to a 400-page book. But
Very glad I did.
But one of the things that was sort of intriguing about that is that sitting in my mind is this line which we've all heard 1,000 times, that governments don't pick winners. Governments don't pick winners in the economy. And as I looked at where the strength and robustness of the economy was and how it had developed, it was very clear the government did, in fact, pick winners all the time. And these were the four big areas. Plus, I mean, property sort of sits under both mining and agriculture. I mean, it's sort of one of the givens as well. And government has done that always. Right, and I mean, I think in many ways the example which exemplifies it most powerfully was the negotiation that Billy Hughes did before he became Prime Minister with the British government, for the British government to buy the total output from Broken Hill and the whole aggregation of Collins House mining companies around Broken Hill and then back into the smelting in South Australia. He negotiated a deal where they would buy the 100% of the output of those mining companies until 1935 at massively inflated war prices. So that basically underwrote the affluence of the sort of Collins House group, which is the sort of foundation of Australian capital in many ways. It was a government deal. It was a government deal that was negotiated for them. And there are different permutations of how this plays, but if you want to be involved in mining, you've got to get tenements, you've got to get leases, you've got to pay royalties. There's a big set of intersection with the public, with government decision making. Similarly with agriculture. Now, the thing that's sort of interesting, and the Collins House group is sort of the tie back to this, is that media has also been a part of that. So that willingness to exercise power through media, to advance your case through media, has always been there. In pre-Federation Australia, the Australia was sort of, or the colonies were known as the Federation of Newspapers. Every town had a newspaper. Now, sometimes it was owned by the mayor, sometimes it was owned by the major landholders, sometimes it was owned by the unions, but there was always newspapers in this, what was a very highly literate society. Over the 20th century, that consolidation occurred and continued to get tighter and tighter until we are at the point we are at now, which, is without precedent.
Yes, despite some of our best efforts to arrest that.
That's right. Yeah.
At a point, I think, where even just in the last decade, the newspapers, News Limited papers and News Corp papers have just dropped all pretense of being anything other than an entirely partisan outfit.
Yeah.
And people, I think, are newly outraged about that. But as your book makes clear, this is an absolutely fundamental part of Australia's foundation story, of white Australia's foundation story, and the role of the media in promoting the interests of men with property. Being the voice of capital, effectively, is how you describe it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a nice quote. I think it's from one of Bridget Griffin Foley's books. Of an interview that she did with was done with Robert Menzies, in which he said, "Well, I couldn't challenge them. I wasn't going to risk taking them on." And then there's another quote. I think it's from Sally Young's book, Paper Empress, where she describes. There's an interview that was done with David McNichol, who was for a very long time Packers, the sleek, grey-haired man of the Packer empire. And he said, "Oh, my whole career has been about trying to convince people what was in their naturally in their interests was not. So my task has been to convince people that what they intuitively know is their interest is actually not in their interests." Thank you, David. That's exactly it.
He did very well, and we saw that play out at the 2019 election, didn't we? Where people voting against their interests quite explicitly. More those that pay attention, those in those seats like the eastern suburbs of Sydney, who are traditional Liberal seats that are driving this teal independence movement, because they are engaged. And at the 2019 election, those seats swung to Labor, even though they had the most to lose from those taxation policies. But the people in the seats that would have benefited from that platform actually swung against Labor because they'd been convinced to be scared, to be fearful. And you talk about that in the book as well, the culture of fear and silence that is used to maintain power.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I guess you have to put this into a global context, and clearly we are in a much better position than people in many other countries, so that's the sort of caveat at the beginning. But the mechanisms that have been used to ensure silence and to instill fear are very, very, very well developed. And I think it's sort of striking to me that in a country where it's grown as a result of migration for over a long period of time, that the normalizing processes of that migration process, they're not designed to encourage boldness in people. It's all about, people are encouraged to think it's about my personal, re-establishing of myself in a new environment, and I will do what I need to do. So it's a sort of privatized sort of experience for many. And there's been a lot of effort to break down, those sort of community connections, which actually introduce people into a collectivist, more an old Australian collectivist sort of model. So it's hard when we've got this dominant mode, which is about privatisation, of everything plus your own experience of a place, to actually build the links of connectedness and collective response. And I think that that fracturing, which really, in my view, has happened over the last 25 years, as the ideas that the old collectivist ideas that we took some comfort from growing up have effectively been privatised. They've been commercialised and privatised, so that they're now jingles for beer companies or whatever they are, and it's about me against everyone else rather than me as a member of this collective against, working together. And so the teal independents have picked up on that. They're re-establishing a collective sense of identity.
I think that's exactly right. And I think what's interesting is you talk about in the book how you use COVID as a kind of X-ray to look at these fault lines. And Janet McColman's here with us, who I co-edited our own collection of essays now 18 months or so ago. One thing that we talked about a lot during COVID, and I felt came through strongly in your book as well, is that idea that it really shone a light on who still holds to that idea of collectivism and who does not. The majority of people actually responded in COVID with a collective response. They were concerned for their neighbours, they were concerned for their friends. There was a noisy minority that was pushing the American line, the freedom line, that this is a terrible imposition and we need to sacrifice old people in order to maintain our freedom, effectively. But I think what was really encouraging for me, and what Janet and I found while we were putting the book together, was that sense of collectivism, that sense of community is still very deep in the Australian culture.
Yeah, I think it is. And one of the things that, it's a perverse benefit, because I know especially people in Melbourne, really suffered during the sort of various lockdowns that you endured. But one of the things that I think is a sort of side benefit of it, in a way, and benefit's the wrong word, but an upside of it, was that people were forced to engage locally in the way they didn't previously have to. So previously you'd drive from wherever it was, you get your bus. You might have had, if you had kids in a local school, you might have had some local connection, but for many people, their lives were detached from where they lived in the granularity of that experience. And so I think that what happened during the sort of COVID period was people were first forced to pay attention to what was happening locally. And so you saw that real flowering of, little Facebook groups and, little responses to particular issues that were occurring in different neighbourhoods. And I think that that's part of what's, part of the reason that the teal independents and the other independents are working as effectively as they are now, because people have switched their gear back to thinking, well, actually what happens in this patch has a bearing on the whole, beyond where I am. And in my thinking about this, I mean, that will only be accentuated by the sort of truth-telling process as forms part of the Uluru, because that again necessarily is local. You know, you need to know what happened in the patch where you are, and some of that will be ghastly, much of it will be ghastly, but some of it will not be. Some of it will be about stories of cooperation and collaboration and challenging authority and so on. And that again pulls us back to a local frame. Now, it's sort of interesting, you know, that in our constitution, local government is not recognised. You know, that was one of the 1980 referendums that didn't get up. But if you go back to the sort of pre-federation debates, there's a lot of discussion about how do you actually keep what's going on really attached to a local, which has a national as well, but, you know, is grounded in the local. So I'm really hopeful that one of the benefits that will, one of the lasting legacies of the COVID situation will be that re-emphasis back on, you know, let's actually talk to each other and see how we can build from that out.
And in that regard, it very much shares what Janet and I wanted to do with our book as well.
Yeah.
Resonated with me. And I think that sort of allows us to talk a little bit about the institutions that maintain power, but also the institutions that maintain democracy and how much they're under threat. The fact that people are feeling, particularly these independent movements, they feel let down by the institution that was the Liberal Party in some of those seats. They feel let down by the institution of Parliament, and they want to change Parliament. They're running on integrity in government. So there are on one side of the ledger the banks, agriculture, the big powerful business interests that maintain power, but our democratic institutions, the ABC, the churches,
the public service.
Yeah, precisely, have been under threat from these same forces.
And it's been deliberate. I mean, you know, I've always been a bit cautious about the whole cultural wars language because I think it was a bit glib and a bit easily sidetracked into, you know, somewhat arcane arguments or very self-interested arguments. But, you know, if you put it into a longer historical context, I mean, the first time the phrase was used explicitly in the US was around the representation of stuff in the Smithsonian in the lead up to the American bicentenary. And then we've sort of picked it up. But, you know, it was a deliberate strategy. I mean, it was a deliberate attempt to undermine what is the sort of human rights inflected agenda. You know, the best bit of the post-war settlements have been about encouraging an expansive, open, you know, capitalism, you know, not unfettered, but, you know, with a human face, and with, you know, growing rights being available. You know, the attempt to undermine that has been very deliberate, and it has had quite dire consequences. So the institutional crumble, you know, you quite rightly identify that as one of the really big issues that's sort of sitting underneath this. I mean, you see it I mentioned the public service, because that privatisation effectively of much of the public service that has come as a consequence of putting pretty arbitrary staff caps, you know, so work can't get done unless you buy it in from the big consulting firms, and, you know, people are sitting in offices next to people who are being paid twice as much as they are to do the same thing, but they're off the books in terms of the sort of the staff caps. The weakening of the public service has been really crucial, but some of the weakening has occurred because the institutions themselves not lived up to their promise. You know, I mean, the process of the churches as a strong institutional base, you know, has been weakened by their own malpractice, you know, the way they've treated people, and you know, we've listened to that, you know, and seen that and experienced that for many years. The weakening of the trade unions was again a fairly deliberate strategy, but, you know, in previous periods of big change, and I think back to the book I wrote in the early 1980s about the recession in the 1980s recession and the restructuring of Australian industry that happened in the mid-80s, you know, under the leadership of the Hawke government. The unions was there providing advice, argument, illustrations, you know, really very actively. And so they've weakened. I mean, well, we've got 15% union membership, you know, then it was probably around 70, you know, nationwide. It's now tiny. So the weakness of that has become much more profound. So think tanks like yours and you know, and others are in there trying to do some of that work, you know, about developing ideas. And I mean, your book was terrific, and there were a bunch of others that were published during that period, you know, and people were excited. They were listening to seminars, you know, they're doing the whole thing. The thing that struck me was that without the broad base of, union membership or, public service support or, a much more robust media, it was very hard for those ideas to get the traction that they needed and deserved. So I think what people have done instead, because they can't belong at an institutional level, your own identity becomes much more important. So identify as a woman or as a mother or as a gay person or, whatever hat I happen to, be wearing dominantly on a day. That's taken over from the institutional connections, which used to provide much stronger threads of belonging and engagement.
I think that's very true. And I think that is often mischaracterized as identity politics. It's not identity politics. It's a way of identifying culturally. That you're right. I think people are making those connections across parts of their identity because the collective institutions aren't there anymore. I see that as quite dangerous.
Yeah.
It's something I'm still struggling with the language to adequately describe, because if you do start having that conversation, you sound like an identity politics right-wing nut job.
Yeah. Which neither of us are. But if you reduce your sense of identity, your belonging to one of, like we all have many layers of identity and belonging. Some will be more dominant at some times than others, and some of them are really central to our being. But if you reduce it down and you don't have those other networks to give you those layers and reinforce those layers, I mean, it makes me nervous, because I think not only are individual lives less rich, but the collective life is weakened as a result.
And one of the quotes I gave recently to a James Button article was my concern about that tendency to identify politically on one or two characteristics makes it impossible to build the kind of collective movement that we need to make change in the interests of those that don't have the power. All we have is numbers. They have the money and the power, if you like.
But that's why the local is important, because I think, I'm watching, for instance, I'm in northern New South Wales. I'm watching the way people are responding, to the ongoing trauma from those floods, and there are big mass meetings happening in all the villages and towns around that area of northern New South Wales. And what you're seeing is people with whole lots of different sorts of backgrounds and things that would have had them absolutely poles apart, because they're focusing on a local thing which is in their patch. I'm not saying it's all light and roses and so on, but it does provide another way of, like we can include all of these things if we've got that as a base.
And actually, I think everyone that's thinking this way is thinking about localism and community-based change and change coming from communities. And of course, that's how all democratic institutions started in the first place. Unions were working people coming together in their interests. Churches were people coming together over faith. So times of crisis and emergency can actually allow us to reinvigorate those institutions from the ground up. And I agree that the teal independence movement's a great example of that.
Yeah, and I mean, it will be interesting to see, because the means of communication of that is not settled. Like in the old days, there would have been, for all the sort of narrowness of the mainstream media, it was still competitive. There were still a couple of newspapers, for a period, the radio and TV stations were not owned by the same company. So there was a really active sort of competition that went on. And, people, the range of debate may not have been as wide as you'd like, but nonetheless, there was some sort of energy in that process. And what worries me now is you've got 19% of people reading the major newspapers. That's nothing really. So people are getting their information from all sorts of, disparate sources. The weakening of the ABC has meant that the shared platform is much less robust than, and SBS, that the shared platform is much less robust than it could be or should be. So I'll be interested to see whether in Australia we start getting things which have happened in a number of other other places, so like internet enabled activism, not just activism, but community connection on local platforms. So there've been some really interesting examples that have happened in the US and Europe and elsewhere, where those sorts of ways of having sophisticated, grown up, tough conversations at a local level are facilitated through digital means.
And just as I think that's like all digital technologies, it's as disruptive, but it can also be a solution to some of the challenges that we have.
If we can figure out, if we can claim it rather than waiting for them to just do what they're going to do.
Look, I could keep going with this all day. We should have really booked a few hours for this conversation, but I will go to the questions because otherwise we won't have time to get through them. I'm going to start with this because I think it is relevant to what we've just been talking about, from Barbara Curzon-Seegers. Hi, Barbara. She says, I think another clear legacy of the Howard years, which has continued to be promulgated, well, she says legacy of Howard, actually, I'll make you own it, which has continued to be promulgated by Conservatives since, is the process of fragmenting Australian communities and demonising by stealth specific groups such as refugees, people dependent on welfare, non-traditional women, LGBTQIA people, Indigenous people, even environmentalists. The divide and conquer approach is so very destructive. However, I feel there has been a concerted effort to embed it again in our politics and society. It's about an us and them, not an all of us. What do you think of this, Julianne, and can we change it? And she said, many thanks for your time.
Yeah, look, it's a very good question and an acute observation. I mean, that was absolutely the stealthiness of the way that Howard went about his pursuing his agenda. I think
it's not nearly as clever at it.
Well, I mean, the people who are advising Howard, who've now been advising Boris Johnson and other people, were absolutely masters of this art. And I mean, if you go to a divide and rule mentality, I mean, it's there. That's the oldest colonial mode. It's divide and rule. So that's been a quite deliberate thing, and I think it plays back into then the emphasis on the privatised. The privatised personal life. I'm preoccupied with my mortgage. I'm preoccupied with how I'm going to get the money to send my children to a private school. God help us. The growth of that private education system has been extraordinary over this same period as well. And with it comes a sort of degree of segregation that was not there when it was a dominant public education system. So that's really exacerbated it. So there are reasons that people play these games, and I think there are lots of tactics that we can use, but I think recognising it and then finding other ways of engaging is obviously the really crucial response. And if that happens at scale, that causes changes, because when governments change, countries change, and the instinct of the sort of many commentators is to say, oh, they're all the same. Actually, they're not. And it's not just the sort of detail, it's actually in a worldview. And we've got scared of talking about worldviews, of how, this country could be different if it was outward looking and expansive and was a model democratic society. We've forgotten talking about that. But that's what's on the table, I think.
I agree wholeheartedly, as you know, and I think the Labor Party has been too scared of that for too long. They incorrectly saw it as the thing that brought down the Keating government, and there is an attempt, I think, to try to have that conversation again. You mentioned private schools there because it's critical, and it goes to the first question that was posed to us today from Russ. He says, I've long felt the apparently limitless amount of money federal governments have been willing to spend on A, private schools, and B, indefinite offshore detention, have fundamentally reshaped our national character for the worse. And now we won't strike a reasonable settlement with Indigenous Australians. Russ agrees the statement from the heart is foundational, but what about those other two issues?
Yeah. Look, the process of the sort of privatising of education, I think, has been an extraordinary exercise. The process, again, of refugees and the amounts of money that have gone into these abominations is really, really distressing. I think one of the things that's really interesting is a few years ago, and this is not just it's certainly pre-COVID, but certainly, even longer ago, global financial crisis type time, the framing of the public discourse, political discourse and policy discourse was absolutely about economics. Economics was it. If you couldn't stack the case up, it would fall over. Now, if you'd used a straight economic rationale for refugees, it would have fallen over because it didn't work. So what happened over that, sort of around the time of the incoming Abbott government and ever since, is that the economic language is still there, although less at the moment, but less is still there as a dominant. But really what's happened is it's been a national security frame which has prevailed. And so as soon as you go to national security, you don't have to worry about the economics. I mean, it was interesting that in in Scott Morrison's first announcements around COVID, he was using national security as the rationale for spending large amounts of money. He wasn't talking about, saving the economy. He was talking about protecting us as a matter of urgency from this virus. So I think that what's happened is we've switched the focus, and now the economic, I've always been critical that the economic frame was too narrow, but I like even less this notion of national security being a proxy that means you can spend money wherever you like and damn the consequences.
Oh no, no one ever asks where the money's coming for submarines, but they want to know where every dollar's coming from to pay for aged care. It drives me absolutely insane. I think so. There's a comment. Sorry, my screen's frozen. Comment from Ken Sayers, which I'm going to just bring in actually. One of the worst legacies of the Howard government is the corporatisation of services such as childcare, aged care, and this has created the crisis we have in both sectors today. Look, I couldn't agree more with that. What are your thoughts about it?
One of my thoughts on that is that I agree that the corporatisation of it has really been problematic, but the principal concern that I have about it is that, it was meant to deliver more efficiency. Well, who knows? It was obviously addressed to, designed to address some of the rigidity of the public sector, which, needed to be addressed. My fundamental problem with it is that those corporations which have grown fat on these businesses have no incentive to solve the underlying problem. They have no incentive to solve the problem which is causing these, behaviours and so on that they're there to serve. So they have become themselves billion-dollar enterprises in some cases, solving a problem or addressing a problem, while there's no money left over then to try and seek to ameliorate the problem or organise a society in a different way that would mean that was less problematic. So that's my concern, that we've actually created another strata of business which is essentially dependent on public money to do something that needs to be done, but in the process we've forgotten about what the problem was that they were there to be solving.
I think, and one of the challenges now, of course, is that we don't have the workforce we need, we don't have the regulatory standards we need, and while in an ideal world care services would be delivered publicly, unscrambling that egg's very, very difficult.
Very difficult, yeah. And we see it so much now with this sort of, the labour shortages. You're employed if you've worked 1 hour a week. I don't quite get it all, but anyway, one of the arguments had always been that immigration didn't depress wages. Well, clearly, if this work can't be done because the wages are too low, actually, that's something that's not going to stack up anymore. And so I think that that rethinking about what meaningful work is done and how it's done. The dependence on the gig economy for, it might be all right when you're a student, but honestly, for that to be the basis of your life, it's just, you're never going to get a secure foothold. And it might be fine if you're a super consultant, but it's not for everybody else.
It's a racial, gendered, class issue. That work is always done by those at the bottom of society because it's reproductive labour. It has its roots in women's work in the home.
Yeah.
I was really thrilled with Labor's announcement at its campaign launch about action for the Fair Work Commission to close the gender pay gap, something we've been pushing for a long time. We're running out of time, which is awful. I hate it when that happens. But I will go to a comment from Rob Morsillo. Hi, Rob. He says, as a personal response, this is coming from our conversation earlier in the hour about property and the amount of where we put our money in Australia, and we don't invest in productive things. As a personal response, Rob asks, is counterculture, small is beautiful, small footprint, eschewing the second property, investing in local, a viable way to survive in Australia, given the overwhelming tide going the other way? So I think, essentially saying those of us that are trying to opt out of the hyper-capitalist by put your money into investment properties and live a more small footprint life, is that something that's going to be possible to maintain or to grow that movement in the face of the kinds of power structures that you describe in this book?
Look, I think it will grow organically of its own volition. I think what I'd like to see in terms of, people will make those sorts of decisions if they decide to, really, I'm going to make my own space, fine, that's available. I'd just like to see Australia having an economy which was more sophisticated. I don't like the fact that we are so dependent on doing something which, is a colonial project. You pull stuff out of the ground and you sell it somewhere else. I don't like that, that dependence has become so narrow, because this is a well-educated country still. It's got very capable people. It's got enormous, resources of human capital and imagination and ingenuity. But our willingness to actually take a punt, take a risk, if we applied some of the spirit that has driven those corporations to be what they are now back into a whole lot of other areas, I think we'd see a much more diversified, much more interesting and much more sustainable economy going forward. And one of the arguments against it historically had been that the capital wasn't available in Australia to do it. It depended on foreign capital. Well, you talk to brokers in New York about the amount of Australian capital that they're playing with, as a result of the superannuation funds, and that will only increase as you see this intergenerational wealth transfer occur over the next decade or more. There's a lot of capital here. So that capacity to do something differently is actually more available, I think, now. Now that's different to, I'm going off grid and I'm going to live my own sort of life as best I can. But there is a bit in between where you actually do need, you want to do something more than run a curtain shop. You want to do something which is actually building something that's got some sort of broader, either for purpose or broader economic scope. And you need capital to do that. So you need to find ways of sourcing that.
Huge area of research for us at Per Capita, the lack of diversity in our economy. Why are we so concerned about losing 30,000 jobs in mining? Well, because there's nothing else for those skilled, highly paid men to do, right? Because we haven't developed those industries. And absolutely, the amount of money in the industry super funds that's having to go offshore to find places to invest because there is nothing here to invest in. They're even investing in build to rent properties in America rather than here.
Yeah.
We've got time for one last question, and it's a really good one, so I want to squeeze it in. Robert Delves, can you talk about our worship of war and the men who fought them as more important to Australian identity than our democratic advances and the fair go that was significant in the same period that the Anzac myth arose, the 1890s to the early 20th century? So I think, really what he's saying is that again has been a deliberate project to form our culture around.
And again, it's a Billy Hughes legacy. I mean, Billy Hughes came back, from the post-World War I conferences and declared that the war had made the nation. Now, the war hadn't made the nation. The war had devastated the nation. It had devastated a generation, killed a generation of men. It left a huge, enormous, gaps, in terms of family formation because there weren't men. It was devastating. The country had been bitterly divided. 2 referendums not got up to have mandatory conscription. But Hughes comes back, and says, "Oh, this has made the nation." I mean, in my view, and I don't really subscribe to the blood sacrifice to make a nation, but that's sort of there in the literature. The blood sacrifice that had occurred in the formation of Australia were the frontier wars. It was the place where tens and tens and tens of thousands, 60,000 people in Queensland from 1860 to Federation alone, as many of them killed in the war, and the same repeated all over. We know about the Black Wars in Tasmania and the wars in Victoria and so on, and New South Wales. So the blood that was spilled in the creation of the nation occurred before Federation, and that was never and has never been acknowledged. So if you subscribe to a blood sacrifice to make a nation, you've got to find another bit to do that, and the First World War was sitting there as a devastating event. So that's not to say that the tragedy wasn't enormous and the consequences were dire, but there's a sort of blindness to the blood that has been spilt on these soils in the pursuit of developing a nation.
Yes, and we now have a political class and leaders who will openly say there has never been a war on Australian soil.
There's never been slavery.
There's never been slavery, right? We didn't. And Captain Cook circumnavigated the country. On that note, look, I'd love to keep talking to you, Julianne. It's such a great book, everyone. I really, really strongly recommend getting your hands on this one. It will resonate with our per capita people. Julianne's been a huge influence on my own thinking and education over many years, well before I met her. So I'm really chuffed to have spoken to you today about what I think is the book of the year. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll have further webinars coming up shortly. We are about to schedule one with Matthew Ricketson about his book, Who Needs the ABC, which is a very important issue at the moment. And again, an institution that desperately needs a change of government if it's to survive and continue to thrive, I think. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you, Julianne, for making time for us and our group here at Per Capita. And we hope to speak to you again soon. There's so much in this book, we might have to do another 2 or 3.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's been a great privilege to talk to you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.